I wonder who this fellow was, this Bartimaeus. We don't know much about him, but it's unique that Mark names him in the gospel. There is no other person on whom Jesus works a miracle or for whom Jesus works a miracle that is named. This is the only one that receives a name. So it tells me that he was a known entity, that people must have known this fellow. Either he was kind of famous or well known at the time, or more likely, when Mark was writing his gospel, the early Christian community knew who this fellow was. So Bartimaeus must have been someone in the early Christian community. He must have been well known. He kind of a famous Christian, as it were. And so Mark kind of drops that name as a way to remind people. It's like, oh yeah, we know that guy. He's the so-and-so in some place, whoever he is. We just don't know. But it makes his story all the more interesting because those first Christians obviously knew who Bartimaeus was, and his story was significant. And I think what's even more significant is that this is the last miracle that Jesus works before entering into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. This is the last disciple to follow Jesus before Palm Sunday. And so there's a great significance here of what's going on. But you have to wonder, Bartimaeus has never seen Jesus. If he's been a beggar, if he's been a blind man sitting on the side of the road, you have to imagine that his day-to-day experience was pretty much the same day in and day out. He gets up, he goes to his begging post, and he spreads out his cloak, and he sits there calling out for alms so that people will help him, so that he can make his daily living, so that he is taken care of each and every day. Probably the same thing over and over and over again. And you have to wonder then, how does he know Jesus? He's never seen him. He's not been one of his disciples. But Bartimaeus doesn't have his sight, but he does have his ears. He's not the kind of guy that's going to say, woe is me, you should have pity on me because I don't have my sight, I'm a blind man. He says rather, I may not have my sight, but I have other gifts. Let me use them. And so he listens. And he sits there on this road from Jericho to Jerusalem, which would have been well traveled. And he listens to what people are talking about. And he probably picks up bits and pieces of who Jesus is. He hears people. He doesn't catch full stories, but he hears probably the conversations and the murmurings going back and forth along this road. And it's that he lets in. And that prepares his heart for the moment when Jesus enters his life. He has been listening. Rather than focusing on the negative, he drinks in everything he can with what he has. And he knows who Jesus is. So that when Jesus appears with this great crowd, he immediately, when he finds out it's Jesus of Nazareth, he immediately calls out, Son of David, have pity on me. See, he doesn't ask the crowd to have pity on him. He doesn't ask other people to have pity on them because he knows their callousness. He knows that most people would look at him and say, you're blind, you deserve it. You probably offended God in some way. You're a sinner, whatever, and would have kept on moving. Remember the story of the Good Samaritan. He knows who Jesus is and calls out for pity, but he uses that special title, Son of David. And that's a charged title because the Jews would have recognized that title as referring to the longed-for Messiah. That was the title that the Old Testament used to talk about the longed-for Messiah. And as soon as he calls out, Son of David, have pity on me, what does the crowd do? They shush him. And even more so, it says they rebuked him. And that's a strong word because that word is the same word that is used when Jesus speaks to devils. He rebukes them to silence them. The crowd is reacting to this blind man and his proclamation of Messiah with vitriol, with strength that says, silence. We don't want to hear that. And yet this is the crowd following Jesus, which I think has to tell us that the crowd doesn't necessarily have faith. I don't know why they're following him, but faith is not found in a crowd. Faith happens on an individual level. This man, this individual, cries out, I believe. I know who you are. The crowd cannot make that declaration. The crowd just moves along, and everybody goes where the crowd goes. You'll notice even when we profess our faith, we do not say, we believe in one God. I believe in one God. We say it for ourselves, but Mother Church says it for herself. It is not a crowd of people announcing this. It is an individual faith that is welling up, that cries out to God, have pity on me. And those words, have mercy on me, pity me, Lord, those have been retained in our liturgy. We sang them this morning. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. One of the most ancient prayers of the church comes from this man crying out, recognizing, I am weak and I need you, Lord. I need you. I don't need money. I don't need possessions. I don't need a job. I just need you. And that's what we cry out at the beginning of every Mass. I am here not because I'm good, not because I have it all put together, but because I am weak and because I need. And I need first, Lord, your mercy and your pity to make me who I am. And so the man comes up to Jesus, and Jesus looks at him and asks him a question that we've heard several times over in recent weeks. What do you want me to do for you? The rich young man came up to Jesus and said, he called out to him, good teacher. And he's like, what do you want from me? I want eternal life. I want to live forever in my riches and my glory and all of the things that I have. And then last week, James and John come up to Jesus and he says, what do you want from me? We want to sit in seats of glory at your right and your left when you come into your kingdom. Finally, somebody knows how to answer Jesus' question, what do you want from me? And it's the blind man, a man who sees by faith. He knows this is the Messiah because he's been listening to him. To be a Christian means we have to unlearn the things we have learned. It means we have to think differently. We have to come to that point that says, I don't know it all. I don't have it all put together. I'm not complete in myself. And now I need to relearn, and I need to change, and I need to be changed. The road to discipleship is hard because it means taking apart almost everything that we have learned to this point and becoming a new person. The blind man was able to do that more easily because he sat in his weakness and he allowed Jesus to heal him. It is when we allow that vulnerability and that weakness to come to the forefront that we find what we need. When we don't try to be something that we're not. When we don't steel ourselves in our rightness or in our knowledge or in our own wisdom. But we recognize, no, I need that man, that God to save me. But I think what's even most stunning about Bartimaeus in his story, he throws away his cloak. It says he threw away his cloak, he leapt up, and he ran to Jesus. And this happened before he was healed. It says Jesus is calling you. He doesn't know that Jesus is going to give him his sight back, but he throws away his cloak. And that's significant because the blind beggar would have spread out his cloak on the ground and sat down upon it. And that was the place where people would throw their money. They would throw the offerings to him to land on the cloak so he could gather it up and take the money that would be his livelihood. But once Jesus calls him, he says, I don't need that anymore. I don't know that he's going to heal me. I don't know that my life is going to be any different after this, but I do know I don't need that. Because if he's called me, I have everything I need. And so he runs away from that cloak and he goes to follow Jesus. And he's given his sight because he's always had it. He always saw who Jesus was. And that's why he could see. Because in faith, the darkness, he knew who Jesus was. And I wonder then if he perhaps was the inspiration for that crowd, or at least some in that crowd. Because those people who witnessed that miracle and who saw a blind man put his vulnerability out there without caring what other people thought of him, that touched hearts. And as soon as Jesus enters into Jerusalem, what does that crowd do? They cry out, Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest to the Son of David. And they take off their cloaks and throw them on the ground. Bartimaeus inspired the faith of the crowd that welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem. And I wonder if maybe later on that some of those believers, because not all of them cried for crucifixion, but maybe some of them would have been there in Jerusalem then on that Pentecost day when Peter preached and they heard the word of God and they were baptized and became the first Christians. Bartimaeus, perhaps, the son of Timaeus, became the father of many faithful. And he did so because he was willing to be weak and vulnerable, to show people that he didn't have it put together, that all he needed was the Messiah, the Son of God. And when he cried out to that, other people's faith began to blossom. This Bartimaeus, we don't know who he is exactly, but we know that he's each of us in some way. We have to be ready to listen for Jesus because he might be passing by at any moment, and we don't know when that moment is going to happen. And we have to be ready because Jesus would never pass this road again. This was Bartimaeus' one and only time, and he leapt for it. When faith moves you, leap for it because it may be your chance. And even in your weakness and vulnerability, let that shine forth because that is going to be inspiring to other people. And you yourself might become a father or a mother to more and more faith. Bartimaeus teaches us how to be a disciple, how to cry out and to say, Son of David, have pity on me. And in that, we finally see what it means to be a disciple.